Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am bringing you week 16 of my 2019 reads. This week was another great reading week. I finished 2 poetry collections and 2 novels. The first poetry collection that I finished was Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Vuong, which was one of the poetry collections that I had put on my TBR for April for National Poetry Month, so I was very glad that I had read it. This collection centers on Vuong's identity. And in particular, there's 2 main parts of his identity that I think are explored. The first is his identity as a Vietnamese American, in particular, talking about his parents' experience being refugees from the Vietnam War. There's a lot in the first half of the poetry collection that looks at kind of that experience of wartime, experience of immigrating and just being refugees. The second half of the book focuses a lot more on his adulthood and being gay. So there's a lot about, I think, relationships with other men in the second half. Overall, I thought that this poetry collection had a lot of emotion in it, a lot of which was very dark, very painful emotions, a lot of anger, a lot of just hurt. But I'm not positive because I found this collection a little difficult for me to completely understand. I think that maybe for somebody who is a more advanced poetry reader than I am, this collection would be just purely outstanding because I felt like there was so much more meaning inside of the poems than I was able to access, which I think partially is just simply due to lack of context. Maybe I don't know enough about the refugee experience, and also just maybe lack of knowledge of poetry. The structure of these poems was sometimes very difficult for me to follow. The wording was a little bit opaque. I just couldn't find a way to connect, to kind of latch onto the meaning of the poems. So even though I could feel a lot of the intense emotion in the poetry, I was left mainly confused by a lot of the poems, and that I have a feeling is not necessarily the poetry collection as much as it is me. So I gave this collection 3 out of 5 stars because of my experience with it, but I really strongly believe that if you are a little bit more experienced with poetry, this collection could be a 5-star read for you. So if you like poetry, I actually highly recommend you give it a try and then let me know what you think and what you understood, because I think there's so much more to this poetry collection than I was able to get out of it. The second poetry collection that I finished this week was Don't Call Us Dead by Danez. This is another poetry collection that was on my April TBR and was actually a gift from my husband, so thank you, Sush. I really enjoyed this poetry collection. I think that this is very similar in theme to a lot of the other books that I read during Black History Month and even some of the other poetry collections that I have read recently, in that it focuses a lot on sort of Black Lives Matter as well as on the experience of being a gay man. So Danez writes these poems which I found so moving, talking about sort of the grief of losing so many people around him to systemic violence, the feeling that his life doesn't matter and that other Black men's lives don't matter. This Don't Call Us Dead title is all about that, you know, about our lives have meaning and wanting to express that meaning, wanting to say, listen and care about us. So I found that message really powerful. Also, Danez is dealing with, I believe, being HIV positive and being gay. Apparently, he had a little thing in one of the poems before it started saying that 1 out of 2 Black gay men in the US has HIV, which is just astounding. That, I mean, 50% is unimaginable. And so there's a lot in this poetry collection about being gay and about being HIV positive. And in particular, I think Danez makes a really interesting point about facing both danger from the outside in terms of systemic violence, as well as from the inside in terms of what his body is doing through HIV. And this feeling of, you know, he's going to eventually die from one or the other, and feeling very much endangered at all times. And just, oh, it was very powerful. And I really connected to a lot of the messages in this poetry collection and a lot of the emotion. I think also he has a great way with words. There were so many phrases in this that I highlighted and found very, very powerful. I think that it is a rather explicit and sometimes very graphic collection though. So that's always a little hard for me. I struggle when there's a lot of kind of rough ideas, rough language, difficult imagery. It's hard. And for me, that was a tough part of this, although maybe also inherently an important part of it. I also, sometimes the structure of the poems was a little hard for me. I'm finding as I read more poetry that I like maybe an older style of poetry, kind of like Poe, where everything's very systematic and rhythmic and easy to follow. Modern poetry doesn't necessarily follow those kind of strict structures, and I'm still getting used to that. So it doesn't always necessarily make it as easy for me to fall into the poems when they don't have that obvious structure, even though I did find a lot of rhythm and flow in the poems in this collection. So I still think it was very, very solid. I gave this poetry collection 4 out of 5 stars, and I think that I would really recommend checking it out to anybody who is interested in the themes that it covers. Next, the first book that I finished this week was Swordheart by Kingfisher, and this is a fantasy love story set in the same world as her previous Clockwork Wars books, which started with the Clockwork Boys. And this, as with the Clockwork Wars books, Sush, my husband, read out loud to me. I really love him reading out loud to me, and once we start a series, he tends to continue reading it to me. So that was really nice. I really enjoyed the beginning of this book. The setup was really interesting. It's about a widow, Hala, who has inherited money, but her in-laws are trying to basically take control of it and get her to marry one of them so that they can have her money. And she discovers a magical sword which contains a mercenary, Sarkis, and he helps her escape, and they go on adventures basically trying to reach some rat priests. They're not actually rats, but they are priests of the Order of the Rat, who specialize in legal affairs so that they can get legal counsel who will help them get Hala's inheritance. And so this first part of the book was really great adventure. They are escaping, there's a lot of drama, there's so much humor in this story. I really do love Kingfisher's humor. And Hala and Sarkis were both very interesting characters. They pick up a rat priest, Zale, who is a lot of fun as well. And they go on adventures in the Vagrant Hills, which are these magical, very, very scary hills, and there's just terrifying monsters in this book. I think that was just one of the most horror-inducing scenes, was when they were in the Vagrant Hills. So all of that was really cool. But then the second half of the book wasn't quite as good for me. The pacing slowed down a little bit, and there also was a lot more focus on the development of the love story between Hala and Sarkis, which is fine. I love love stories, but I've noticed this before. I don't always agree with the way that Kingfisher writes relationships. Sometimes I feel like they can be a little bit unhealthy emotionally, and that kind of happened in this book as well. So that part was not so much my style, but I really enjoyed the first half of the book. And so overall, I gave this story 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I finished this week was Unkindness of Ghost by River Solomon. This is a book that was on my February TBR, and I'd heard about it from a couple different people. I think from Tatiana at Musical Tati, as well as Njeri at ONYX Pages. And then it turns out that this month it was the book selection for the SOULar-powered Afrofuturism slow reading group, which I will link the Goodreads to below, which is hosted by Njeri at ONYX Pages. And I thought this is a perfect time to read it, so I picked it up, and it was a great book. It is very, very powerful. There's a lot of meaning in this book. It is a sci-fi set on a generation ship where, unfortunately, it's got a very racist and oppressive social structure where the higher levels of the ship is filled with white people who live lives of luxury, and the lower part of the ship is filled with black people who are basically slaves that are constantly terrorized and abused. So it is not a light book. There is a lot of actual violence and trauma, which usually would make a book very difficult for me, but this book was so amazing in terms of the content, in terms of the themes, in terms of the social issues that I've explored, that I ended up really, really loving it. The story follows Aster, who is a botanist and a doctor, and she lives in the lower decks. She definitely faces a ton of oppression. She's Black, she is gender non-conforming, she is also autistic. She struggles especially with social interactions and sort of reading between the lines, and she is trying to understand what's going on in the ship. There's something wrong with the ship. The sovereign, the sort of white leader of the ship, has an illness, and that illness is very similar to an illness that her mother had 25 years ago when Aster was born. And her mother has these journals which are written in code talking about what was going on with the ship then, and it seems like something very similar is going on now. So Aster, along with her friend Giselle and her friend Theo, must uncover what's going on with the ship. And this adventure is a mystery. It is a very dark world with a lot of abuse throughout, but they're trying to unravel what was going on with the ship. Why is it set up this way? And also throughout it, they're realizing that it can't just stay with the status quo. Things need to change. I really liked all of the different characters. There was so much exploration of queerness, of mental health issues. Giselle I found to be a really fascinating character. She has major emotional issues like bipolar maybe, and she was just really fascinating. Theo was really interesting as well. He was also non-gender conforming and struggled with his race. He's sort of biracial, passes as white, but feels very connected to Aster and the rest of the lower decks. So there was just such an interesting exploration of so many different themes in this book, and in particular an exploration of how even in this very futuristic setting, we cannot escape these ghosts of our past, our history, our ways of being, our ancestors, and how does that all tie together, and how can we somehow reconcile these things and move forward, and how can we make basically society better. So the themes in this book were really spectacular. Definitely, I give warnings for a lot of violence, especially sexual violence, but also tons of physical violence that is perpetrated upon all of the people in the lower decks. However, very rarely for me, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars despite all of that violence, because I found the messages so meaningful, and I thought that a lot of that trauma that was experienced was part of that message, and so it felt not gratuitous but instead very purposeful. So I really recommend this. I also really recommend reading this and discussing it with other people. I found that discussing it with the SOULar-powered Afrofuturist slow reading group was so meaningful, because there was a lot about this book that was very layered, a lot of meaning and a lot of experiences that I don't have, that I missed when I was reading, or that I saw one perspective but there's a lot of other perspectives. It was just a great experience to understand the book more thoroughly through discussion. So I highly recommend discussing it with other people if you get a chance to read this book, which I recommend that you do. Okay, that wraps up my week 16 reads. I hope that you've had a great reading week as well. And if you have read any of these books or you have any comments, I'd really love to hear them below. So please leave a comment. And good reading, and see you next week.